Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Outdoor Art Club's webinar, Hidden Consequences, the Broader Impacts of Incarceration on Families. I'm Jane Skurridge, and I'm working with Lois Ashley to bring you today's program. The Outdoor Art Club is a women's organization focused on civic and charitable work in the Bay Area. Today, as we celebrate our 120th anniversary, we're presenting the first of our year-long public speaker series. I have one housekeeping item to pass on. We're saving the last 15 minutes of today's program for a question and answer session. Our speaker looks forward to answering your questions, so please send your questions using the Q&A function, which should be located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Thank you for joining us. And now it's time for me to introduce Karen Jernstedt, who is the program chair for today's event. Welcome, Karen, and thank you for bringing us this program.
Hello, I seem to not be able to start my video. So you will hear from me without a picture. It's my pleasure today to welcome Erin McCauley, Assistant Professor at UCSF. Erin is one of Mill Valley's own, the daughter of John and Cindy, our past president. She was educated in our public schools, Old Mill School, Mill Valley Middle School, and Tam High, and then continued her education at the University of Oregon, where she became interested in youth in the juvenile justice system. After graduating, she served 2 years with Teach for America in Stamford, Connecticut, where she met her husband, Devin. She pursued graduate work at Vanderbilt University, where she received her master's in education, and then Cornell University, earning her Ph.D. She's been at UCSF since January of this year, where, in addition to teaching and mentoring, she conducts research on how mass incarceration acts as a mechanism for social stratification and inequality. Erin and Devin currently live in Pacifica with their 2 dogs. Devin is a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford. In her free time, Erin enjoys crocheting, reading, hiking, and craft beer. Welcome, Erin. We are eager to hear what you bring to us today.
Thank you, Karen, for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to present here. As Karen said, my name is Erin McCauley, and I'm an assistant professor at UC San Francisco. Today, I'll be discussing the broader impacts of incarceration on families, with a specific focus on the intergenerational consequences of incarceration for children and young adults. I'm excited to share the results of a recent study with you all, where we focus on how the stigma of having an incarcerated parent affects how teachers treat students. So I'll begin by giving an overview of mass incarceration in the United States, as well as in California. Then I'll discuss the broader literature about how incarceration affects families and children, and then dive into a recent study to share the results with y'all. Then I'll wrap up by talking about some ideas about how we can reduce the impact of incarceration on children and young adults. And we'll now begin with this focus on what is mass incarceration and the discussion of the size and scope of the criminal legal system in the US. So the United States is in a period of mass incarceration. And this graph shows the number of people under the supervision of the criminal legal system in the US between the 1980s and 2018. As you can see, the number of people under the supervision of the criminal legal system has increased dramatically over time and remains quite high. Our current rate of incarceration is not just historically unique, given our own history, but it's also internationally quite unique. This graph from the Prison Policy Initiative, which has great data visualizations if anyone is interested in learning more about mass incarceration, compares the incarceration rate, or the number of individuals who are incarcerated per 100,000 people in the population within the US, and compares it to the other founding NATO countries, what you can think of as our peer nations. As you can see, the risk of incarceration in the US is dramatically higher when compared to the other founding NATO countries. In fact, the US has the highest incarceration rate in the world. While this graph compares the US to a group of peer nations, frankly, it doesn't really matter who we compare ourselves to. The US will always have the highest incarceration rate. And importantly, this isn't necessarily a function of crime. meaning that our elevated incarceration rate is not due to a higher level of crime in our country. It's simply a higher incarceration rate. And importantly, incarceration in the US is also highly unequal. The risk of experiencing incarceration is concentrated among Black and Latino men. Over the life course, 1 in 3 Black men will spend time in prison, compared to 1 in 6 Latino men, and only 1 in 17 white men. This is despite similar rates of behaviors or activity across groups. In fact, one study examining racial differences in alcohol and drug-related arrests found that the odds of being booked into jail, as opposed to merely cited and released, varied dramatically by race, with Black individuals having nearly twice the odds of being convicted and serving time compared to a white individual for the same misdemeanor offense. And as you know, California is a unique state in the US, both socially and politically. So I think it's important to spend a little bit of time today focusing on mass incarceration in our own backyard, given the audience here, even though my work is national. In California, we have more than 200,000 people who are incarcerated, and another 8 million people who have a history of incarceration or a criminal record. So if we return to that original graph from the Prison Policy Initiative comparing incarceration rates between countries, we can actually compare the incarceration rate in California to the US and our peer nations. As you can see, California has a higher incarceration rate than the US's peer nations, the founding NATO countries. And even though it is slightly smaller than the United States broadly, if California were to secede from the US and become its own nation, it would have the 5th highest incarceration rate in the world, coming in just shy of El Salvador. And incarceration in California is also highly unequal, again, mirroring incarceration in the United States more broadly. This graph from the Prison Policy Initiative shows the number of incarcerated individuals per racial ethnic group per 100,000 people of that group in the general population. You can see that the incarceration rate is highest among Black Californians, where there are more than 3,000 Black Californians incarcerated per 100,000 Black Californians. This rate is 4 times greater than among Hispanic or Latinx Californians, and nearly 7 times greater than among white Californians. And so in thinking about mass incarceration, it really refers to the historically and internationally unparalleled rate and disparity of criminal legal system involvement in the US. And the size and scope of criminal legal involvement in this country raises questions about how this institution shapes broader society, both through the individual level effects of incarceration for those who have been incarcerated, those involved in the criminal legal system, but also through the broader consequences of incarceration for the families and communities of the incarcerated. And this question is what we're going to look at next. First, I'm going to discuss the state of research in this area, including my own, summarizing what we generally know about the harms of parental incarceration. Then I'll be presenting the results of a recent study, which is currently under review for publication, which explores how the stigma of having an incarcerated parent shapes students' educational experience by affecting the behaviors of teachers. And the consequences of incarceration, as I said, are not limited to incarcerated individuals. These individuals are in families, and because of geographic variation in incarceration, these effects are really concentrated in specific communities. And there's a robust body of literature at the kind of intersection of public health, sociology, economics, which has found ample evidence to support both individual level effects of incarceration, but also population level effects on things like health, education, employment, and social inequality. And much of my research focuses on the family level consequences of incarceration, linking the incarceration of a parent to the health and well-being of children and young adults. So first you might be thinking, well, how common is this really? And so I'm going to start by talking about family member incarceration. In recent work by Enns and colleagues, where they did a large study to estimate the prevalence of parental incarceration, familial incarceration, and a bunch of other forms of contact with the criminal legal system, found that over 40% of Americans have an immediate family member who's been incarcerated. When broken out by race, we can see that these risks, not surprisingly, are higher among Native American and Black individuals compared to whites, but it's pretty high across all groups. And experiencing the incarceration of a family member causes disruptions to the family life. First, there are economic consequences. And research by the Fines and Fees Justice Center found that 2 in 3 families with an incarcerated family member were unable to meet basic financial needs like food costs and housing costs. And, incarceration really shapes family finances in a few ways, three of which I'm going to highlight. First, the majority of incarcerated people, especially within families and especially parents, were contributing financially to the household prior to incarceration. And this includes non-resident parents. So even if parents aren't together or living together, typically an incarcerated family member was providing financial support to the family prior to incarceration. And so there's an immediate loss of income. It's harder to pay the bills. There are also costs associated with incarceration. One study, in fact, found that families incurred more than $13,000 in court-related fines and fees if they had an incarcerated family member. In some states, individuals have to pay kind of room and board for their incarceration. And regardless of that, there are often exorbitant costs associated with contact with folks who are incarcerated, such as extremely high rates for phone calls or video visits, which often contributes to family financial strain. And then even after folks are released from incarceration, they tend to face a loss of job prospects over their life course. And this affects the lifetime earnings of a family and the resources that exist to support families. Research by Dr. Pager found that having a criminal record was associated with a 50% decrease in the likelihood of receiving a job callback. And so the kind of a family costs of incarceration don't end when that person is done serving their time. These costs continue across the life course of the individual. Second, incarceration also affects the health and well-being of families. Incarceration in the family increases stress and can be really traumatic, especially for children and young adults. There are also steep health declines following incarceration. So when individuals are released, they are more likely to experience poor health. And that puts a tax on the rest of the family to do caregiving that wouldn't necessarily have ordinarily happened if someone had not been incarcerated. And there's also a shifted burden of care associated with this. So whether it's kind of children of incarcerated parents getting sick, having increased stress, formerly incarcerated individuals having steep health declines, there's just a lot more care that needs to be occurring in the family. And last, incarceration shapes the form and function of families. It's associated with a high risk of relationship dissolution, which is when partners break up, which increases the risk of things like complex family formations, like multi-partner fertility. There are also shifts in caregiving during incarceration. So there's kind of an immediate disruption in caregiving arrangements and the daily routines of children and adults. And last, there may be differential resource access. So depending on where a formerly incarcerated person lives or what their crime was, what their conviction was, it's possible that families may lose access to things like Section 8 housing, to food stamp eligibility, or cash assistance programs. And that can really further exacerbate the financial problems associated with incarceration or cause families to choose to either keep an incarcerated family member in their home or choose the resources that they need to survive. And so given the texture and scope of these family level disruptions, we have reason to believe that the fallout of incarceration for families would have especially acute consequences for children of incarcerated parents, really pointing to parental incarceration as a particularly salient risk related to mass incarceration. And so next we'll turn specifically to the incarceration of a parent. And this graph, also by Enns and colleagues, shows the risk of ever experiencing parental incarceration. For the full population, about 1 in 5 Americans will experience the incarceration of a parent. And mirroring the risk of incarceration itself, there are, again, not surprisingly, racial disparities in the likelihood of experiencing parental incarceration, with highest risk among Native American, Black, and Hispanic or Latinx individuals, although high across all groups. And this really concentrates the disadvantages associated with parental incarceration among specific communities. And then I also just wanted to share this last graph from Enns and colleagues, where you can see that the risk of experiencing parental incarceration is considerably higher among people of a younger age. This reflects the growth in mass incarceration over time. So if we look at the youngest age cohort in this study, which is 18 to 29-year-olds, so young adults, we see that 1 in 3 will experience the incarceration of a parent. And so if there are any negative consequences of parental incarceration, because parental incarceration is so common and also unequally distributed, these risks, these consequences may kind of map up to have larger effects on the population, which really further existing inequalities such as racial or class-based disparities. And this really points to the criminal legal system as an important setting with structural influences on inequality, both among incarcerated individuals, which is well documented, but also as we're beginning to understand intergenerationally through affecting the children of incarcerated parents. And unfortunately, there are a lot of negative consequences of parental incarceration. There's been this growing body of literature over the last 15 years looking at the collateral consequences of incarceration for children, finding aggregate worse outcomes across a variety of domains. Paternal incarceration especially, but parental incarceration more broadly, is associated with worse physical and mental health, including a higher risk of child mortality and worse self-rated health among children. It's also associated with a higher risk of conduct disorders, behavioral disorders, and even physical aggression among youth. And having an incarcerated parent is associated with an increased risk of negative experiences in institutional settings, including things like the child welfare system, the criminal legal system itself, and then the education system, which is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of today, and also is a big focus of my work, because it is a really important institution for youth and their development, but also for social inequality. We know that the education system is sometimes referred to as the great equalizer. It's an opportunity for social mobility and to change one's standing in life. In research on parental incarceration and education, including research that I've done and my colleagues have done, has found that there are negative consequences for behavioral issues such as truancy and a higher risk of dropping out. There are consequences for decreased learning ability and skill development in reading and math. And interestingly, recent experimental work has found that teachers actually hold lower expectations for children with incarcerated parents. And this lowered expectations piece is kind of more newly discovered in this literature. And it's rather interesting as it suggests that bias may be playing a role in the other consequences that we see of incarceration for children and young adults. Just by the nature of being a child who has an incarcerated parent, something no one has any control over, it's possible that teachers may be treating these students differently due to bias and stigma because they hold these lower expectations. And I would like to take a moment to showcase the potential power of being treated differently by playing a brief video clip of an interview with a young woman with an incarcerated parent, so you can hear about this experience from someone's own lived experience.
A lot of people had, they felt sorry for me. So a lot of people treated me differently. I got special treatment, and then I also got treated, you know, kind of bad too because of the fact that she was in prison.
So as that young woman describes, children of incarcerated parents are often treated differently, sometimes receiving special treatment and sometimes being treated worse. And the research study I'll present today focuses in on stigma and this experience of differential treatment. And in this context, I'll be looking at the context really of teachers in education in high school. And this may sound familiar if you are familiar with education research. You know, kind of one of the core theories in education is known as the self-fulfilling prophecy theory. Many people have heard the term the soft bigotry of low expectations. And basically, this theory suggests that differential expectations cause teachers to differentiate their behavior toward students, such as providing little feedback on student errors or providing certain students less time to answer questions during class or referring only some students to resources. And these teacher behaviors, repeated day in and day out over the course of years, can negatively impact student performance and ultimately perpetuates the achievement gap. In sum, by expecting students to do worse, teachers may alter their behavior in ways that cause students to, in fact, do worse. They're matching their efforts to expectations and because of the missed opportunities for growth. And given the existing research demonstrating that teachers do, in fact, hold lower expectations for students with incarcerated parents, it's really vital to know if these lowered expectations translate to differential behavior. You know, and as a former teacher myself, I can attest that these are often unconscious biases that are really playing out without knowledge. And so it's important to understand if this is happening so that we can potentially develop an intervention to stem these effects. In a recent study, I examined just this, testing to see if teachers would treat an otherwise identical student differently if they believed that the student had an incarcerated parent. This is part of a larger project, but I'm going to share just one study coming out of it today. This is a study I did in 2021, and we're going to go a little in depth on it. So hope you're along for the journey. Specifically in this study, I examined how the incarceration of a student's father or mother affects how appropriate teachers think different college and career track programs are for a student, as well as which program the teacher would actually refer the student to. I also look at if this effect is different for children with a white associated name or a Black associated name, because the experience of criminal legal involvement is very racialized in our country. In this study, teachers read a little vignette or a biography about a student, which is identical, except for some of them mention that the student has an incarcerated mom or dad, and half of them use a white associated name and half use a Black associated name. Then teachers will do a bunch of tasks in a survey, including rating how appropriate different college and career track programs are on a scale of 1 to 5, and then referring the student to just one of those programs. And then I'm able to look at if reading the biography, which is otherwise identical, but mentions the incarceration of a parent, has the consequence of having teachers really think differently about the appropriateness of these programs, or even refer the student to a different program. And this part's a little bit more nerdy, but I just want to highlight some of the aims of this research project. A lot of research in this area on parental incarceration, including the majority of my own, is really based on an observational design. But because families which experience incarceration also experience a host of other disadvantages, things like employment instability or poverty, it can be difficult to disentangle the effects of familial incarceration from other consequences, other disadvantages. And so because I use more of an experimental design in this study, I can focus on just the effect of parental incarceration, providing a more direct or causal test of the effect of parental incarceration. I also focus on stigma. And so a lot of research in this area doesn't focus on stigma or thinks more about perceptions of stigma. But what I'm really interested in is if there are actual differences in behavior related to stigma. And then last, I focus on the institution with which a child of an incarcerated parent interacts. And people think about parental incarceration as affecting children of incarcerated parents by shaping the individual behaviors of children and their families. But it really may also affect how systems and institutions respond to that student and family in ways that may perpetuate inequality. And so shifting that gaze a little bit can allow us to look at a different aspect. And so to do this, I fielded a survey. It was done online, and I got a little over 1,500 high school teachers across the US to complete the survey. The survey was fielded between October of 2020 and March of 2021, which is, I know, an unusual time period, so I'm happy to talk about that. But I just recruited from 3 different school districts in each US state and invited folks to participate through web scraping email addresses. This is not a nationally representative sample, but it does have folks represented from each state. And then teachers in the survey would read the student biography. It was randomly assigned which one they got, although they are identical with the exception of parental incarceration and race. They rated the appropriateness of the college and career track programs, referred the student to one program, and then filled out a questionnaire about themselves. And I know I'm kind of hammering this home, but the different experimental conditions were parental incarceration, where there's either no mention of parental incarceration, mention that the father was in prison, mention that the mother was in prison, and then the biographies either used a white or a Black associated name. And so I'm not going to read the whole student biography, but this gives you an idea. So the biography either started with Connor or Deshawn as a new student in your classroom. You had not met Connor or Deshawn before this year. In the first few weeks of school, you learned that Connor or Deshawn is a fan of the Green Bay Packers football team, enjoys listening to music, and loves sneakers. You've noticed he doodles in class instead of taking notes. So all the teachers would get this information exactly the same, besides the name. So everyone would know that he doodles in class and loves sneakers. But in the next part of the biography, there's a difference between the main control group, no mention of incarceration, and the 2 treatment groups, paternal and maternal incarceration. So for the control group, it says neither of his parents came to open house night, and his teacher from last year tells you she's not surprised. Whereas for the treatment groups, while everything else is the same, it says neither of his parents came to open house night, and his teacher from last year tells you that she's not surprised and that either his dad or his mom is in prison. Then it ends the same way for everyone. And then here are the different college and career track programs. There are 2 that are for, you would think mostly are for students who are going to go to college. It's college counseling that helps students navigate the application process. And the third one, an SAT, ACT intensive prep course. And then there are 2 programs that are for students that teachers might expect to go more into a vocation or kind of direct into work. One is a vocational program where students are doing vocational apprentices. or apprenticeships, excuse me. And then the other is a career service, where there are really job shadow opportunities to help youth connect with the types of trade industries they may want to go into. And so now I'm going to show you the results of what I found. So this looks at the unadjusted means for teachers' average ratings of appropriateness for the programs. I'm also going to show in a graph, which is a little easier to soak in, but just for anyone who wants the numbers, here they are. First, we're going to look at the appropriateness of career programs. And again, this was on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being least appropriate and 5 being most appropriate. So for teachers who were assigned to the control group, which means they had no mention of parental incarceration in the student's biography, there were half who received a biography with a white associated name and half with a black associated name. And you can see that for the white students, so teachers who believe the student was white, there's an average of 2.75 on the scale of 1 to 5. For the black student, it was a little bit higher. If we move to paternal incarceration, same setup. This mentions that the father was in prison and half had a white and half had a black associated name in that student biography. And you can see that again, it's a little bit higher in the black than the white condition. And if we compare within the white condition and the black condition between control and paternal incarceration, we see that there's a little bit of difference. And last, for maternal incarceration, we see it's a 2.9 if the teacher believed the student was white, and a 2.97, so essentially a 3 if they believed the student was black. And so now if we look at the appropriateness of college programs, that was that SAT prep and the college counselor. If we look in the control group, which is no parental incarceration, we can see that the scores were higher if they believe the student was white than black. We see the same thing in the paternal incarceration condition. And again, not much change between the parental incarceration conditions. And similarly with maternal incarceration, we see this racial gap, but not a lot of difference by parental incarceration. And so now we're going to look at the graph. This graph shows the linear prediction of appropriateness on a scale of 1 to 5. Essentially, I ran some fancy models that adjust for things like the teacher characteristics. And then it makes a prediction of what the score would be if you kind of netted out those other differences. But essentially, it's very similar to the unadjusted means we just saw. We're going to look first at the ratings of appropriateness for the career track and in the control group. So this is when teachers did not have any mention of parental incarceration in the student's biography. As you can see, the red dot, which refers to teachers who believe the student was black, has a higher rating of appropriateness for the career track programs than the white student, who is the blue dot. And this difference is statistically significant, meaning it's larger than we would expect from random variation. We think there's really something going on there. There's a racial gap. If we next look at teachers who believe that the student had an incarcerated father, we see something similar. Again, teachers rated the career track program as more appropriate if the student was black compared to if the same student was white. And this difference is again statistically significant. Also, if we look between the control group and the paternal incarceration group, you can see that the line doesn't change that much. So right here, the line is pretty straight, and so that means there isn't a lot of difference by parental incarceration. And then next we look at maternal incarceration. And what we see here is that there's actually kind of a convergence. There isn't a lot of difference by race, so it's not significant. There is some slants here in the line, but not a lot. And now we're going to move to the college track programs. And here, using the kind of the same setup on the y-axis up here, we see the linear prediction of appropriateness, or just the average on that scale of 1 to 5. And across the bottom, we see our parental incarceration conditions. So we're going to start with the control group, who received no mention of parental incarceration. We see that in this case, the kind of opposite is true of the career track programs. If the teacher believed that the same student was white, they had a higher rating of appropriateness for the college track program. And this is again significant. When we move to paternal incarceration, we see that it's a similar situation. The teacher rated the college track program as more appropriate if the student was white than black. And again, this is significant. If we look at these lines, for the student who is black, teachers who believe the student is black, there's not much difference here. If we look at teachers who believe the student was white, they did rate the college track program as slightly less appropriate for the student if they believe they had an incarcerated father compared to no parental incarceration, although again, kind of a moderate slope decrease there. And then last, if we look at maternal incarceration, we again see this convergence. There's no difference by race, at least not one that's statistically significant. And then we also see between paternal and maternal incarceration, not much difference in this line. But again, if the teachers believe that the student is white, there is a difference between this control condition, meaning no mention of parent incarceration, and if they believe that the student has an incarcerated mom. And so if we think about this together, what we see is that teachers assess career track programs as more appropriate and college track programs as less appropriate when the same student has a Black name compared to a white name. But we don't see a lot of difference by parental incarceration, which surprised me a bit. And so now we're going to look at which program teachers actually referred the student to. Same setup as last time, but this will be the proportion of teachers who referred the student to a college track program. So if we look at the control condition, meaning there was no mention of parental incarceration, almost 30% of teachers referred the student to a college track program if they believed that the student was white, compared to only 11% if they believed that the student was Black. When we move to the paternal incarceration condition, so teachers who believed that the student had an incarcerated father, we see that 12% of teachers who believed the student was white referred the student to the college track program, and 13% if they believed the student was Black. So what we see is if you look between the control condition here at almost 30%, here to 12%, this is the big difference. For the Black associated name, there is a little difference, but not nearly as big as here, and now these are actually quite similar. When we move to the maternal incarceration condition, we see a very similar trend. If you're looking at the white group compared to the control group, it goes from almost 30% to closer to 10%, 27 to 13. And then here we have 10% compared to 10%. And so if we look at this in the graph, this is what it looks like. On this side, we have the probability of referring the student to a college track program. Across the bottom, we have the parental incarceration conditions. And in that control condition, where teachers believed that the student did not have an incarcerated parent, there's a very large and significant racial gap, meaning teachers were considerably more likely to refer the student to a college track program if they had a white associated name. But when we look at the paternal incarceration condition, there is convergence by race, so there's no difference by race. If you're looking at the teachers who believe the student had a Black associated name, this line's really steady across all conditions, so not a lot of difference. But among teachers who believe that the student was white, there's a very large decrease here, where teachers who believe the student had an incarcerated father had a much lower probability of referring the student to a college track program. And the same is true in the maternal incarceration condition. So I didn't find a lot of difference between paternal and maternal incarceration, but among teachers who believe the student was white, there's quite a big difference here. And so teachers had a lower odds of referring the student to a college program if they believed that the student was Black. And if the teachers believed the student was white, they had lower odds of referring the student to a college track program if they had an incarcerated parent. And so what I find is that it's really a racialized effect, but a pretty substantial effect. And so I find in terms of stigma and discrimination only, that parental incarceration matters sometimes. Parental incarceration didn't have a big effect on teachers' ratings of appropriateness, although student race really did. But teachers have lower odds of referring the student to college if they have an incarcerated parent when the student is white, but the same isn't true if the student is Black. And this is potentially because the probability of referring the student to a college track program was already so low in that condition that it's hard to have an additional independent effect. So it's not necessarily that it doesn't matter. It's just that there's so much stigma that students are facing on the basis of race that parental incarceration didn't have an additional effect. And so in thinking about the implications of this work, parental incarceration is likely to have an effect on educational trajectories and the attainment of youth. This points to incarceration as a potentially important factor in intergenerational mobility, given how important education is. And it opens the question of how stigma may shape other academic experiences and experiences in other institutions, right? So in my project, I look at things other than college track program referral, finding quite different effects. And so before we end, I do want to take just a moment to talk about what we can do about this, because we're not powerless, and what I've captured are pretty negative effects of parental incarceration. And I'm happy to talk more about these, but my suggestions based on what we know in the literature are that we increase contact with families. So when folks are incarcerated, we know if they have contact with their family members on the outside, there are better outcomes for those family members and better outcomes for the formerly incarcerated individuals when they're released. They're less likely to commit new crimes, and they're less likely to go back to prison or jail. We could also better support families experiencing incarceration. There are not a lot of social service agencies that work specifically with this population, but it's a really important population, and these families really need support. We're lucky to have one locally. And then last, we also really need to think about improving training for professionals and the family consequences of incarceration. As someone who was a trained secondary teacher and then went on to get my master's in education, parental incarceration was at no point mentioned in my training. And, now that we know that 1 in 3 youth are going to experience the incarceration of a parent, this should really be a part of that training, especially because teachers, the number one reason that they state for why they want to teach is to make a difference, to help youth and undo inequality. Education can be a mechanism of social mobility, but only if we are prepared to let it be as such. And so providing that training for professionals, and especially in the context of things like education, we don't know how the stigma acts if we're looking at the child welfare system or the healthcare system or the criminal legal system necessarily, but we would expect it to have similar consequences. And those are also trained professionals. They're going through really similar systems for training. That these are licensed programs, we can intervene. And then before I wrap up, I just want to thank my mentors and advisors. This work was done under some excellent mentorship from Christopher Wildeman at Duke, Melissa Ferguson at Yale, Anna Haskins at Notre Dame, and Daniel Lichter at Cornell. And I also want to thank the funders. I would not have been able to do the survey without the support of the National Science Foundation, the Fosbeck Fund for Research and Experimentation, and the Center for the Study of Inequality at Cornell University. And then I want to thank all of you for being here today to engage with me on this topic. And I especially want to thank Karen Jernstead for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here back in Mill Valley, at least on Zoom, to share this work. And I am really excited to hear what y'all have to say or any lingering questions you have.
Thank you, Erin. A fascinating research you've worked on. Is very thought-provoking for all of us. I want to open to just a quick question that I just jotted down. Did you say that for people aged 18 to 29, that 1 in 3 has an incarcerated parent? Not
at that time, but 1 in 3 will experience the incarceration of their parents. They may have been incarcerated when they were 5 or when they were 20 or when they were 25. But yes, one in 3. So it's a much larger group of youth than we would previously have thought.
That's a staggering number. Thank you. Sharon Packer Rosenthal, I'm wondering if you could rephrase your question for me. I'm having a little trouble understanding it, and I'm going to go to another question and give you some time to rewrite that for me. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to go to a question from Kate McCormick. In the experiment, you focus on high school. Why did you choose high school, and what might be different if you focused earlier in the educational trajectory of children?
Great, thank you for that question, Kate. I chose to focus on high school for a few reasons. I'll say selfishly first, I'm really familiar with high school. I was a high school teacher myself. I taught in the 11th and 12th grade in an alternative school for youth who had behavioral issues resulting from trauma, most of whom had not found success in traditional education settings. And so I was most familiar with how this stigma works in that setting based on my experience as a practitioner, as a teacher. But I also thought it was really important to think about this time period because it's a really important moment in youth's educational trajectories, because it's where the sorting happens about who's going to go to college and who's not. And we know that going to college has a really big impact on folks long term, on their income, on their prestige, on their housing. It's just a very important outcome. And then also, although the majority of research in this area actually does look at youth when they're much younger, so looking at things like kindergarten, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, I thought it was really important to look at high school when we're talking about stigma, because we have a reason to think that there'll be different responses or different ideas, different types of stigma for these youth as they're older. So often when children are really young, there's kind of this gleam of innocence, but as children get older, they're more likely to encounter things like stigma and discrimination. And so if we're focusing on high school, that's when these things might be the most salient.
Thank you. And Katie Olds would like to ask, do you have any theories about why the default teacher assessment is to refer white kids to college track programs much more than Black kids in the control group?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so I thought I was going to find more about parental incarceration in this study, and I did in other parts of the larger project that looked at other things like grading and responding to behavioral issues. But for this, I really just found a very large racial effect. This is consistent with literature over about the last 30 years, finding that Black students face a lot of stigma and discrimination in the educational context. And so really, I think it's a response to our society that unfortunately in many ways has negative perceptions of Black youth and their potential. We know that a lot less Black youth go to college. It's been a very narrowing gap, so it's better now than it was before. And there's some other experimental research by folks who study education, so better positioned than I to talk about it. But they found that things like access to college counselors accounts for quite a large amount of the education gap and who goes to college or not. And that schools that serve majority Black students had less college counselors, and also that college counselors were less likely to refer Black students to high prestige schools. Some of that may be ideas about the socioeconomic standing of the families and if they can afford to send the students to college. Some of it may be ideas about the student that are negative. I will also say that, this was done in 2020, 2021, which was a very unusual year. It was not my plan when I designed this study to have it go out during a global pandemic where everyone was working from home and a lot less people went to college. There's information in the background part of the study where the teachers learn about the student, where they grade a sample of the student's work. And it's not a great essay that they grade. It's kind of a low achieving essay. And we also know that things like stigma and discrimination are more likely to come out in kind of moments of ambiguity. So if the student is like a rock star student or the student is a really, really poor student, there's likely less racial disparity in those referrals. But it's that kind of middle ground where they might be able to do it if they have a little bit more support, but they also might not if they don't get that support, where we really see these disparities come out.
Thank you. Robin Geisler has a question, and I know Robin, and she is a retired teacher. So she says, very interesting work. Thank you. I'm wondering if the words last year's teacher was not surprised might have affected the results of your study. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Robin. Thank you so much for asking it, because I think it's an important thing to point out, especially for folks who might not be teachers and might not know how that's read. So I can't speak to every circumstance. And so an experiment is best when you've accounted for as much of the other variation as you can. And so in this context, we describe a student that doesn't have parent engagement in their education, not a lot of parent engagement in their education based on what teachers receive information about in any context. And then we're looking at if parent incarceration kind of beyond that has an effect, because there's reason to believe if we didn't mention anything about parent engagement, teachers may think an incarcerated parent won't be able to be engaged in the student's education, which is often true if they're incarcerated and can't come to things like parent-teacher night. And so what we might catch then is actually the effect of an unengaged parent in teachers' assessments of students and not parent incarceration. And so we make it really explicit if the student has an incarcerated parent or not. And I think one way that we can see the effect of this is overall those rates of referring students to a college track program were really low. 30% for white students without an incarcerated parent is low. As I said, I think some of it is the time in which the study was done. Not as many students are going to college now as previously. It's coming back up, but especially during those peak pandemic years when everything was remote and families were experiencing economic consequences of the pandemic. And then also, the student didn't have a great essay. And so, I think that's some of the reasons that are low, but I think that also plays a role. I've also looked at whether teachers expect the student to be from a low income area or not, to see kind of what the role of income is in there. And so, if parents are working double shifts, you may be expecting that they're from a low income background, regardless of parent incarceration. So just trying to make as many of those things explicit as possible. I would love to keep going with this work and look at other contexts. So like if we have a student who's a parent that's engaged and then goes to incarceration, would that matter differently? It probably would. I will also say that, as I'm sure Robin knows, relationships between students and teachers really unfold over a long time scale. And so this kind of one-off shot might not be exactly how it looks in real life when these relationships are developing over time. And so I've done some things to adjust for that in the study, like some of the outcomes I say, imagine this is the first time that a behavioral incident has happened, and then imagine it's the second time, to try and capture that change. But I'm also interested in future work to do surveys with teachers that go over an entire school year. And then at some point during the school year, maybe the student's parent gets incarcerated. So we can really see how these relationships evolve over time when there's a real relationship between teachers and students.
Thank you. So Sharon got back to me, and apologies for having some trouble with her keyboard. So in essence, her questions are about your methodology. And she said, this is social science. And did you work to find flaws in your study methodology? I have trouble with that
Yeah,
word.
thank you for that question. That, the hard sciences may have much harder coursework leading up to it, but when you're in the social sciences, studying people is messy. And it always is. And so we take as many steps as we can to try and ensure the validity of the study. A few things that I did specifically toward this methodology is that when I was developing the student biographies and the student work, I met with small groups of teachers to have them read over the materials with me, provide me feedback, and I developed them over about 3 months. I also had secondary teachers do the survey with no experimental manipulations, just to see how the responses would go, how they would track together, how they wouldn't track together, and where teachers could provide feedback. I then piloted the survey with 3 different populations to see if we were getting the results we expected. There isn't a lot of research like this looking at parental incarceration. It's among the first, but there is research using similar designs looking at race. And so one of the reasons race was included is because obviously incarceration is a racialized experience in the US, but also because I was able to take things like the survey questions from other studies finding racial disparities and use them in this. And so I could validate my survey materials by finding the same thing that other researchers found in the context of that control group looking at the racial gap. And if I replicate that, then I'm finding the same thing as them, where I'm validating their experiment and they're validating mine, and then I'm also adding the parent incarceration bit. And so hopefully that provides some clarity. And I know this is a tricky area, especially because as a former teacher myself, I know that teachers are often piled upon, asked to do more and more and more things with less and less support, and certainly less and less pay. And so my aim is not to portray teachers as the kind of the bad people in this circumstance. Most teachers are working extremely hard under very chaotic conditions. But I think if teachers knew that this was a thing that they should be looking out for, if they knew that 1 in 3 children had an incarcerated parent and that these unconscious biases may creep up, it would go a long way toward improving the educational experiences of children of incarcerated parents. We've had large gains in the racial gap in education, and a lot of that has been through teacher training and intervention and knowledge. But those decreases in the education gap actually stalled at around the same time as the growth in mass incarceration. And there are some people who would argue, and it can't be proven, but we're working toward it, that some of the reason that these education gaps, after closing for so long, stalled out is because mass incarceration is unequally distributed by race. And so there are a lot of negative consequences specifically for children of incarcerated parents who are more likely to be Black. These could be underlying some of our existing racial disparities. And I think most teachers would want to be able to help undo that if only they were given the knowledge.
She also continues her question with, do you think the concept of social promotion affects these outcomes and how it impacts school success? And
yes, another excellent question.
Okay.
So in another part of the larger project, so not what I shared here today, but another task that teachers do in the survey is they grade student work and provide feedback for the student. And this was informed by the idea of social promotion. And so we find some evidence that by an economist, Dr. Cho, that found that children with incarcerated mothers were actually less likely than their peers to be held back using administrative data and kind of matching as close as possible youth who look similar in their administrative data other than the incarceration of a mother. And so, in her work, she was quite surprised to find that these students were less likely to be held back and argued that it might be social promotion. That there's a lot of empathy for these students. This is obviously a hard time. And so they're basically passed up a grade, even if they haven't met the requirements. And while this has some immediate benefits for self-esteem, connection, it's keeping them with their peers who may be a really large support network. Often social promotion kind of backfires because students aren't prepared for the next level of education. And so what I find evidence of in the part of this study that looks at grading is a social promotion story. I find that students with incarcerated parents receive slightly higher grades, and they receive less detailed and specific feedback to help the student improve. It was kind of overly positive platitudes like excellent try, good job. Obviously not for every youth, but that was kind of the pattern of the feedback. And so it really is in line with the concept of social promotion. And it really impacts school success and student success because, there can be immediate benefits. And for some students, after that first year, maybe their parents released, maybe they have more support networks to help them deal with the stress and trauma of watching a parent be incarcerated, arrested, sent to jail, visiting them. They may rebound. And so it might be good for them to not be held back. But other students, this may just be kind of another moment where then they're just being set up to struggle in the coming years. And so, these things are really complicated on the ground. So I really appreciate that question.
Tracy Houghton wants to ask, how is your research being used to change public policy? Is there an organization we can join or support that is focused on reversing the rate of incarceration in California?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Thank you, Tracy. It's also nice to see your name out here. I was friends with Tracy's daughter when I was growing up. So I think first, my PhD is in sociology, but it's from my Department of Public Policy. And so, I'm really interested in this policy question. And I personally never originally intended to study stigma. It's less of a policy question and more of a practice and intervention question. But things in my research kind of just kept pointing to the importance of stigma because it's understudied. And in some ways, we know a lot of the negative consequences of incarceration for our society, for children of incarcerated parents, for our economy. But that hasn't really prompted a lot of change. And so we know that it's bad. We know why it's bad. We know how to make it better, decarceration, of which there's been a bit of a move toward during the pandemic, given how clear it's kind of unveiled how connected community health and health behind bars is to our society. And so beyond kind of my caveat to say that I'm basically always arguing for decarceration, like there is no reason that we should have such a dramatically higher incarceration rate than the other countries that are our peers and even that aren't our peers. Like it doesn't matter who we compare ourselves to, we have a higher incarceration rate. And so I think the biggest policy is that we need to reduce the size of the criminal legal system. And that's through both alternatives to incarceration, it's through investing in community neighborhoods, it's through releasing folks early for things like good behavior. It's bail reform, it's a lot of those buzzy policies. But I also think that if we're thinking specifically about parental incarceration, there are some surprising things that we can do to help basically create those connections between incarcerated folks and their families. And so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen for just a moment. Sorry, I've got my little chat right in the way. Oh, shucks, hold on. There we go. So under my solutions for increasing contact with families, I think in addition to promoting alternatives to incarceration, there are some policies that we could implement, like if it would be beneficial to incarcerate people in local jails instead of state prisons, that really allows people to be closer to their families. If you're visiting someone and they're in the Bay Area versus if you're visiting someone and they're several hours away, that really shapes how much access you can have to them. Another is that we can try and guarantee in-person visitation rights. So there's been a move in the last 10 years, but especially the last 4 or 5 years to move away from in-person visitation. Things like using video visits instead. But we know that in-person visitation really makes a big difference in how connected, especially children, feel to their parents. They're used to hugging them. They want to be able to share private information with them. And that's just a lot harder to do on video visits. And so to the extent that it's possible to guarantee those visitation rights, I also think reducing or eliminating the cost of video or phone visits. So, it's been a bit in the media in the last few years, but the cost of things like phone calls between correctional facilities and folks on the outside are way, way, way higher than it would cost for you or me to make a phone call. And so just reducing that barrier a little bit would make a big difference. We could also create family-friendly visitation spaces and entrance policies. So I've been to a lot of correctional facilities in the last 15 years doing this work, and some of them have children areas specifically where they have, Disney princesses painted on the wall and jungle themes, just to try and make children feel more comfortable. And that I think could reduce the trauma of visiting a parent and keep folks better connected. And then facilitate transportation to correctional facilities. Correctional facilities are also often kind of isolated from the rest of society, so they can be difficult to get to. So kind of reducing that barrier, I think, will make a difference as well. And a lot of these can be done through policies. In terms of local organizations, we're really lucky to have the Aviary organization, I believe. which works specifically with children of incarcerated parents. I have just learned about them because I've been out, well, I'm a product of Mill Valley. I have been gone since 2008. And so I've just recently returned. I've mostly been doing my work in the South and working with a large group of organizations down there who are advocating for decarceration, for differential and better treatment of LGBT folks while they're incarcerated. But I'm just getting connected back into the California groups that are working on this. And so, I would highly recommend looking at that group. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. We have several more questions. I know we're nearing the end of our scheduled programming, which would be 2 o'clock, but Erin has agreed to stay with us for a few more minutes to answer a few more questions. She does need to leave by 2:10, but I want to just, for those of you who need to leave at 2, I want to say thank you so very much to Erin for your presentation, and thank you for agreeing to stay for a few more minutes. For those of you who are leaving us by 2, I'd like to let you know that our next public program will be a panel from the League of Women Voters moderated by Lynn Dooley. This is on Thursday, October 6th at 1 p.m. And please visit the Outdoor Art Club website to register. And thank you very much for joining us. So now we're going to go back and hope to get to some more of these questions. Erin, did you find that there is a racial bias to financial accessibility for college with high school students of color, or was this something that you even researched?
It was not something that I researched in this study, and I don't necessarily study educational equity. I just am kind of adjacent to it and looking at parent incarceration. But when I was studying as a teacher myself, and then to get my master's in education at Vanderbilt, I think that we learned a lot about educational inequality, and definitely a part of it is that the cost of college. I think we know that the cost of college has gone up dramatically over time. And it's actually a really big player in the wealth gap between white and Black Americans. And so actually, if we compare the wealth gap between white and Black Americans today to the 1960s, the wealth gap is actually greater now than it was in the 1960s. There's more racial inequality in wealth. And one of the reasons is actually because students of color, specifically Black students, take on a lot of college debt because in order to access these institutions, it's exorbitantly expensive. And so it's definitely a real barrier. Again, I haven't looked at it in my own research. I just know that it's a persistent issue because of racial disparities in wealth and income and family finances, that it also plays a big role long-term in maintaining that disparity in familial wealth.
Thank you. Leslie Wachtel is wondering, where are you going next with this line of research?
Thank you for that question, Leslie. Next, I'm interested in looking at how the same stigma functions in the healthcare system. We know that there are pretty big disparities in health for children of incarcerated parents. There are some of these immediate effects, which we kind of struggle to understand, things like increased risk of infant mortality. But there are also kind of longer term consequences through adolescence and into early adulthood in terms of things like sexual and reproductive health, in terms of health behaviors. And so trying to identify, what part of that is kind of processing or dealing with the stress and trauma of experiencing a parent incarceration, what part of it are the economic consequences for families, which may limit access to care. And then is there a part of it that is stigma or discrimination while receiving healthcare? And we know in other contexts that stigma can be really important in healthcare, especially for LGBT folks who are trying to receive care, for people who have stigmatized health conditions, such as struggling with substance use. And so just really seeing what's happening there in terms of parental incarceration. And then I'm also interested in looking at the stigma of incarceration itself and how we can stop those steep declines in health that I talked about that follow incarceration. There's this thing called the healthy prisoner complex. And it's the idea that when folks are incarcerated, their health is actually better than when they're not incarcerated. And that's, beyond the fact that, there's a really high representation of folks with disabilities who are incarcerated. While there is some access to care, often folks still have to pay to see a healthcare provider. And even if it's only $5, that's a lot when you're unable to work, or if you're able to work for, 20 cents an hour, 30 cents an hour. And so trying to really understand that process as well, because we know it affects individuals and it affects their families.
Okay. Our next question is from Allison Lang. What can we learn from other countries that have lower incarceration rates?
Excellent question, Allison. I think that's really important to think about that because we are so unique. I think it's easy to be here and kind of focused on our political strife and conflicts and understanding our system. But really, when we're the only people doing it this way, like we have to look outside of ourselves and look to other countries to see what they're doing. I'm really privileged to be at UCSF, even though I've been there less than a year, but so far it's been a really wonderful experience. And a big part of that is Dr. Bree Williams, who's at UCSF, and she runs the AMEND program. But one of her big focuses in her research, and I've learned a lot from her, is that she focuses on kind of the culture of work in correctional facilities. And actually folks that work in correctional facilities, like correctional officers and staff members, have a really low expected lifetime mortality rate. And so, the average life expectancy for folks who work in correctional facilities can be 55 in some studies, 65 in other studies, but it's much younger than the general population. And so there's something about correctional facilities, the stress, the physical built environment, that's bad for everyone's health. And so in her work, she looks at other countries and kind of studies their experiences of work and how they set up their correctional facilities, and then actually sends correctional officers from the US to different European countries to see how their criminal legal system works. I don't study this directly, but I've learned a lot from her and from her work and the work of many of the people in her lab. And they find a few things. One, in a lot of European correctional facilities, folks are able to leave. So they can go work out in the outside and then come back to the correctional facility at night. Folks are also able to have some things like privacy. They can, close their doors and spend time in their own room versus not, and that kind of sense of autonomy. We've also built our correctional facilities in many ways to punish, but we know that kind of the punish idea doesn't work. The more contact someone has with the criminal legal system, the more likely they are to have future involvement in the criminal legal system. So if you take two people at like age 16 who commit their first offense, if one of them is given a ticket and sent away and the other one spends some time in a juvenile correctional facility, if we follow those people for the rest of their lives, they have really divergent trajectories. And so if we can kind of get people away from facilities as often as possible, immerse them in the community, build stronger connections between community and correctional facilities, then hopefully we can reduce the incarceration rate. And I think that's really at the center of things. But one thing I try to hold true in my own work, just because I do focus so much on children of incarcerated parents, is that even if tomorrow we radically changed our system and never incarcerated another person ever again, we would still have the 1 in 3 youth who experienced incarceration of a parent. And the consequences on their lives would continue to underpin racial disparities. And so when we think about the system, I think it's easier to think about the incarcerated person, but it's really so much broader than that. It's their community that's having people come in and out frequently who have an erosion of political power because they're unable to vote in many circumstances, at least for periods of time. It's counting people where they're incarcerated and not where they live in terms of political representation. It's the families and how we can support them. And they have a much stronger safety and social network in other countries than we do.
That's so much fascinating information, and it takes us back to one of your original slides that showed the immense number of people incarcerated in the United States and particularly in California. So thank you for that answer. Ellen Hall says, I'm involved with I believe it's pronounced Caros Outside, which supports women who have husbands, sons, daughters, or grandchildren in prison. We don't have a focus on the education of children. What suggestions do you have to possibly support their efforts to help children in their educational goals?
Great, thank you for that question, and thank you for the work that you do with that organization. I think it's a really important organization that's doing a lot of work. Women really bear a lot of this burden because criminal legal system involvement is so much more common among men. I will say that women are one of the fastest growing groups in terms of the growth in mass incarceration, but by and large, they're doing the supporting on the outside. In fact, that study looking at the prevalence of family member incarceration found when you look by gender that more than 50% of women experience the incarceration of an immediate family member. And when you look by race and education, it's 75% of Black women who do not have a high school degree who have an immediate family member incarcerated. And so when we think about these consequences, I think about those women because those women need the most support. If you're interested in expanding into a focus on education, I think that things that can really help, mentorship programs have proven to be effective, just to give the kids somebody else to talk about these goals and ideas with. I also think that providing academic support can be really important. So, these youth may miss parts of their schooling because they're dealing with the stress and trauma of having a parent that's been incarcerated. And so giving them access to things like after school tutoring can be really important. And then also like liaising between families and these and these schools. So, there's a lot of work by Dr. Anna Haskins that looks at how families who have had really negative institutional experiences may avoid other institutions. And so families where you've experienced a lot of incarceration, a lot of policing, you might avoid schools because they seem like surveilling institutions as well. And then also, if you're that mom who's doing a lot of supporting, or that grandmother who is doing all of this supporting, you may not have time to interface with your kid's school as much as you would want to. And so being able to play that go-between role, I was originally in some ways brought to this work because I was an advocate for youth of color in the juvenile justice system when I was an undergraduate. And a lot of the work that I did as an advocate was really connecting these families back to institutions that can serve them with support to do so. But I'm also happy to follow up, if you want to continue this conversation and the organization is interested in expanding to education.
Thank you, Erin. I know you have to have time to take a deep breath before you head on to your next class. And we do have some other questions that are very interesting and some comments. So I'm going to try to get those to you if you have time, to follow up. And I know you probably know quite a few of these questioners because of your lifetime in Mill Valley. So thank you again, and thank all of you who attended and have taken the time to ask some very, very interesting questions to help us better understand this incarceration problem that we seem to have here in the United States. And Erin, thank you, and hopefully you will come back and talk to us again when you have some more enlightened information to share with us about this issue. So thanks, everybody. And please join us again for more Outdoor Art Club webinars. Thank you.